1916, North Carolina Appalachians. Silas Ward wrapped his hands around a rope, tightened it across a 13-year-old boy's wrists, and dragged him into a cave where human bones lay scattered like firewood. The boy screamed. Nobody heard him. For over a year, this man had been hunting people across Madison County, killing 3, carving symbols into trees with their blood, and building stone altars in the forest where he whispered to something that wasn't God. The mountains kept his secret. Until now. Before we go any further, subscribe to this channel, follow this story to the very end, and comment the city you're watching from so I can see just how far this darkness has traveled. In the winter of 1908, a man walked into the land office in Marshall, North Carolina, and paid cash for 40 acres on a ridge so remote that even the mail carrier refused to climb it. The clerk behind the desk, a man named Harold Estes, remembered the transaction for the rest of his life. Not because the amount was unusual, not because the land was valuable, but because of the man who bought it. Harold told his wife that night, "That fellow didn't blink, not once. I sat across from him for 20 minutes, and he never blinked." His wife told him he was being foolish. Lots of men don't blink much. Harold shook his head. No, this was different. It was like looking at something wearing a man's face. The buyer signed the deed as Silas Ward. No middle name, no forwarding address, no references. In Madison County, where families had known each other for generations, where bloodlines ran back to the Revolutionary War, a man with no past was a man with something to hide. But nobody asked questions. And that was the first mistake. See, in 1908, Madison County was still bleeding. The Civil War had ended 43 years earlier, but the wounds were fresh as yesterday. This was a place where Confederate and Union sympathies had split families apart, where the Shelton Laurel Massacre of 1863 still haunted the collective memory, 13 men and boys executed without trial by Confederate soldiers, their own neighbors, where black sharecroppers worked land they would never own, watched by white landowners who feared them and needed them in equal measure, where poverty wasn't a condition, it was an inheritance. Into this fractured world, Silas Ward arrived like smoke, quiet, weightless, and impossible to hold. His nearest neighbor was a man named George Holt, a livestock farmer struggling to feed 5 children on 60 acres of rocky soil. George was a God-fearing man, a deacon at Beach Glen Baptist Church, and he believed in welcoming strangers. So 3 weeks after Silas moved in, George hiked up the ridge with a basket of cornbread and a jar of apple butter his wife had put up that fall. He knocked on the cabin door. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. He set the basket on the porch and turned to leave. "Don't come back." George spun around. Silas stood in the doorway. He hadn't opened the door. He'd been standing behind it the whole time, listening. George tried to smile. "Just being neighborly, friend. My wife made, I'm not your friend. Take your bread and go." George Holt was not an easily shaken man. He'd survived diphtheria, buried 2 children before their first birthday, and stared down a black bear on his own property. But he told his wife that evening, "Martha, something ain't right about that man on the ridge. I felt cold standing next to him, and it was the middle of June." Martha told him to leave it alone. They had enough trouble without borrowing more. For the next 7 years, that's exactly what happened. People left Silas Ward alone. He came into town maybe twice a year, always to the general store, always paying cash, always buying the same things: salt, rope, kerosene, nails. He never bought food. That detail stuck with the store owner, Cecil Murray, who mentioned it to the sheriff one afternoon. Man never buys flour, never buys sugar, never buys coffee. What's he eating up there? The sheriff, a man named Roy Shelton, shrugged. Maybe he hunts. Nobody hears gunshots from that ridge, Roy, not ever. Sheriff Shelton looked out the window and said nothing. Years passed. Children grew. Seasons turned. The textile mills down in Asheville pulled young men out of the mountains with promises of wages, and some of them came back broken, coughing blood from cotton dust. The ones who stayed behind farmed, hunted, prayed, and tried not to think about the world beyond the ridgeline. Then Sarah Holt disappeared. It was October of 1915. She was 17 years old, strong, smart. Her father, George, the same man who'd carried cornbread up the ridge 7 years before, had taught her to read from the Bible and to shoot a rifle by the time she was 12. Sarah wasn't a girl who got lost in the woods. She knew every trail, every creek, every hollow within 5 miles of her home. She went out to gather chestnuts one morning and never came back. George searched until dark. Then he lit a torch and searched until dawn. By the second day, he had organized a party of 15 men. They combed every ridge, every ravine, every abandoned mine shaft. Nothing, not a footprint, not a scrap of fabric, not a single chestnut dropped on the trail. On the third night, George sat on his porch and wept. His wife Martha stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, and said the thing neither of them wanted to say. "George, what about the man on the ridge?" George wiped his face. "I've thought about it, and I'll go up there at first light." He didn't go alone. He brought his brother, Thomas, and a neighbor named Bill Ramsey, a man who'd served in the Spanish-American War and still carried a sidearm everywhere he went. The three men climbed the ridge in silence. What they found at Silas Ward's cabin stopped them cold. The yard was clean, unnaturally clean. No leaves, no dirt tracked on the porch. The firewood was stacked with mathematical precision. And on the door, carved deep into the wood with a blade, was a symbol none of them recognized. It looked like a circle with 3 lines cutting through it, and at the base of each line, a smaller circle, like drops of blood frozen in wood. Thomas Holt took a step back. "George, we need the sheriff." George didn't move. "I need my daughter." He pounded on the door. "Ward, open this door, you hear me? Open it." Silence. Bill Ramsey drew his pistol. "Step aside, George." But before either man could act, the door opened. Silas stood there, thin as a fence post, his eyes flat and gray, his hands hanging at his sides. He looked at George with no expression at all. George's voice cracked. "Where is she? Where is my Sarah?" Silas tilted his head, like a dog hearing a strange sound. "The mountains take what they need." George lunged. Thomas and Bill barely held him back. George was screaming, sobbing, his fists swinging at air. Silas didn't flinch, didn't step back, just stood there and watched, the way a man watches rain. Bill kept his pistol raised. "We're coming back with the law, Ward, and if that girl is on your land, God help you." Silas looked at Bill, and for the first time something moved behind those gray eyes. Something like amusement. "God doesn't come up here," Silas said. "He never has." They brought Sheriff Shelton the next morning. Shelton searched the cabin and found nothing. No blood, no clothing, no sign of Sarah. Just a clean, cold room with a mattress on the floor and a shelf full of glass jars containing things the sheriff couldn't identify. Roots, powders, dark liquids, and one jar with something small and pale floating in it that Shelton refused to describe in his report. He told George the truth as he saw it. "I can't arrest a man for being strange, George. I need evidence." George stared at him. "My daughter is gone." "I know, and I'm sorry, but I need more than a feeling." That winter was the worst in anyone's memory. Not because of the cold, because of the fear. Families that had left their doors unlocked for generations began bolting them shut. Mothers wouldn't let children walk to school alone. Men carried rifles to the outhouse. And then Daniel Pierce vanished. Daniel was 21, a hunter so skilled that people said he could track a deer by its breath in the cold air. He went into the high timber in January of 1916 and never returned. His dog came home 3 days later, whimpering, its paws bloody, a piece of rope tied around its neck that Daniel had never owned. Daniel's father, a hard man named Ezekiel Pierce, did not weep, did not pray. He loaded his rifle, walked to the sheriff's office, and said 5 words. "It's the man on the ridge." Sheriff Shelton sent a telegram to Raleigh. He'd never done that before. He'd handled moonshiners, cattle thieves, and bar fights for 20 years without outside help. But this was beyond him, and he knew it. The telegram read, "2 missing, suspect but no evidence, need investigator." 3 weeks later, a man named Marcus Webb arrived on the train from Raleigh. He was 44 years old, a former Pinkerton agent turned state investigator, and he'd worked cases across the South that most men couldn't stomach. He carried a leather satchel, a notebook, and a revolver he'd never had to fire. Webb sat with Sheriff Shelton for 2 hours. He listened. He wrote. He asked one question that changed everything. "Show me on a map where each person was last seen." Shelton spread the county map on his desk. He marked Sarah Holt's last known location, Daniel Pierce's hunting route, and then, almost as an afterthought, he marked a third point. This woman, Emma Caldwell, school teacher, went missing about 6 weeks ago. We figured she'd moved on. Teachers come and go. Webb looked at the 3 points on the map. Then he took a pencil and drew a curve connecting them, a semicircle. He tapped the center of that arc. "Who lives here?" Shelton's face went white. "Man named Silas Ward." Webb closed his notebook and stood up. "Sheriff, I'm going to need every able-bodied man you can gather, and I'm going to need them by morning." Shelton hesitated. "Mr. Webb, that ridge is difficult terrain. And Ward, people around here, they say things about him." "What kind of things?" The sheriff looked out the window at the mountains, gray and ancient against the winter sky, and said something that Marcus Webb would never forget. "They say he talks to something up there, and they say it talks back." Webb didn't respond. He didn't believe in spirits or demons or mountain curses. He believed in evidence. He believed in patterns. And the pattern he'd just seen on that map told him one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was happening on that ridge, it wasn't finished. Marcus Webb didn't sleep that night. He sat in the back room of Sheriff Shelton's office with a county map spread before him, tracing the semicircle again and again with his finger. And each time he came back to the same center point. Silas Ward's cabin. 3 people missing, 3 points on a map, 1 man in the middle. Webb had worked 17 cases across the Carolinas and Georgia, and he knew one truth that never failed him. Patterns don't lie. People lie. Mountains don't arrange the dead in geometric shapes. Men do. By dawn, Shelton had gathered 22 men, farmers, hunters, 2 former soldiers, a blacksmith named Roan Cutshaw, who stood 6'4" and carried an axe handle instead of a rifle, because he said guns jammed, but oak never did. They assembled outside the courthouse in the gray February cold, breath rising like smoke, and not one of them spoke above a whisper. Webb stood before them and said only this: "We're going up that ridge. We're searching every inch of that man's land. If you find anything, don't touch it. Call for me. If he runs, don't shoot unless he's armed. I need him alive. The families need answers." George Holt stepped forward. His face had aged 10 years in 4 months. His eyes were red, hollowed out from grief and sleeplessness. "Mr. Webb, I want to be in the first group." Webb studied him. "Mr. Holt, I understand why, but I need men who can think clearly up there." George grabbed Webb's arm. "That man took my daughter. You put me in front, or I'll go up alone. Your choice." Webb nodded. He knew better than to argue with a father's rage. They started the climb at 7 in the morning, February 1916. The trail was steep and narrow, barely wide enough for 1 man at a time. Halfway up, Roan Cutshaw stopped the line. He pointed at a tree to the left of the trail. Something had been carved into the bark, a circle with 3 lines through it, the same symbol George had seen on Silas Ward's cabin door months ago. Webb pulled out his notebook and sketched it. How old is this carving? Cutshaw ran his thumb across it. Barks healed some, 6 months, maybe more. They found another one 50 yards ahead, then another, then 4 more in a cluster, all on trees facing the trail, all at eye level, as if whoever carved them wanted them to be seen. Wanted people walking this path to know they were entering something, or being watched by something. Thomas Holt, George's brother, muttered under his breath. He marked his territory like an animal. Webb said nothing. He counted the carvings, 12 by the time they reached the ridge. 12 symbols carved into living trees, and at the base of the last tree, driven into the roots like a nail into flesh, a rusted hunting knife with a blade stained so dark it was almost black. Cutshaw picked it up and turned it in his hands. "This ain't rust, Mr. Webb." Webb took the knife. He smelled it. His face didn't change, but his hand tightened around the handle. He wrapped it in cloth and placed it in his satchel without a word. The cabin came into view 20 minutes later. Shelton raised his hand and the line stopped. Silence. No smoke from the chimney. No movement behind the single window. The door was closed. The yard was empty and clean, exactly as George had described it months before. Impossibly clean, as if the dirt itself had been swept away. Webb sent 4 men around the back. He positioned Cutshaw and 2 others near the tree line. Then he walked to the front door with Shelton beside him and knocked. Nothing. He knocked again. "Silas Ward, this is Marcus Webb, state investigator from Raleigh. Open the door." Silence. Then a voice, thin, calm, almost amused. "You brought an army for one man?" Webb kept his voice level. "I brought men to search your property, Mr. Ward. You can cooperate or you can make this harder. Your choice." The door opened. Silas stood there, and every man who saw him later said the same thing. He looked like he'd been expecting them. Not surprised, not afraid. He looked like a man who had already decided how this would end. Silas stepped aside. "Search whatever you like. The mountains don't care about warrants." Webb entered the cabin. 1 room, 1 mattress, 1 shelf of glass jars, a small iron stove, a table with a single chair, no books, no photographs, no letters, nothing that connected this man to any life before this ridge. It was the home of someone who had erased himself. Webb examined the jars, roots, dried plants, dark liquids he couldn't identify. And in the back corner of the shelf, a jar containing something small and pale suspended in murky fluid. Webb held it up to the light. His jaw tightened. He set it down carefully and turned to Silas. "What is this?" Silas smiled. It was the first time anyone had ever seen him smile, and every man present wished they hadn't. "A gift from the ground." Webb placed the jar in his satchel. He turned to Shelton. "Get him outside. Keep 2 men on him at all times. We're searching the woods." Shelton grabbed Silas by the arm. Silas didn't resist. He walked out calmly, sat on a stump, and folded his hands in his lap. He looked at George Holt and said 3 words that nearly got him killed on the spot. "She sang beautifully." George lunged. 3 men caught him. He was screaming, clawing at the air, tears streaming down his face. "What did you do to her? Where is my daughter? Tell me where she is." Silas watched him thrash and said nothing more. That smile stayed on his face like something painted there. Webb organized the search in a grid pattern, something he'd learned from the Pinkerton days. 20 men spreading outward from the cabin in measured intervals. Within the first hour, they found the first clearing, a circle of flat stones stacked precisely, forming what Webb could only describe as an altar. Dark stains covered the top stone. Around it, more carvings in the trees. Different from the ones on the trail, these were deeper, more elaborate, circles within circles, lines that branched like veins. Bill Ramsey, the war veteran, stood at the edge of the clearing and shook his head. "I fought in Cuba. I saw men die in ways that would turn your stomach, but this right here makes my blood cold." The second clearing was found an hour later, deeper in the woods, larger, more stones, and this time, buried beneath a flat rock, a bundle of cloth stained brown with old blood. Inside the cloth were personal items, a hair ribbon, a brass button, a leather strap from a school teacher's satchel. Webb held up the ribbon. His hand was steady, but his voice dropped to a whisper. "George, come here." George walked over. He looked at the ribbon. His knees buckled. Thomas caught him before he hit the ground. "That's Sarah's," George said. "Martha tied it in her hair the morning she left." Webb placed the ribbon in an evidence bag and kept moving. He could not stop. He could not let grief slow the search, because he already knew they were close to something worse. By mid-afternoon, Cutshaw's group found the cave. It was hidden behind a rock fall on the north face of the ridge, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Cutshaw called for Webb, and when Webb arrived, Cutshaw's face was gray. "I went in about 10 feet, Cutshaw said. "Then I came back out." "Why?" Cutshaw looked at his hands. They were trembling. This was a man who bent horseshoes for entertainment. "Because of what I smelled, and because of what I heard." "What did you hear?" Cutshaw swallowed. "Breathing." Webb drew his revolver. He ordered 2 men to hold position at the entrance with lanterns. Then he went in. The passage was tight for the first 15 feet. Then it opened into a chamber roughly the size of a small room. The smell hit him immediately. Old blood, decay, something sweet and rotten underneath it all, like fruit left in the sun for weeks. He raised his lantern. Along the walls, more carvings. On the floor, clothing. A man's boots, a woman's shawl. Fragments of bone, some of them cracked and scraped with marks that Webb recognized from his years of casework. Tool marks. Someone had cut these bones. And then, in the far corner, pressed against the rock wall, barely visible in the lantern light, 2 eyes stared back at him. Webb nearly fired. His finger touched the trigger, but the eyes blinked. And then a voice, small and broken and barely human, whispered 2 words. "Please, help." It was a boy, thin as a skeleton, filthy. His wrists were raw and scarred from being bound. His feet were bare and bloody. He was shaking so violently that his teeth chattered like stones in a jar. Webb holstered his revolver and knelt. "Son, what's your name?" The boy's lips moved. No sound came out. Webb leaned closer. "Timothy," the boy whispered. "Timothy Baker." Webb felt something collapse inside his chest. Timothy Baker, 13 years old, missing since December of 1914. Over a year. Over a year in this cave, in this darkness, with this man. Webb took off his coat and wrapped it around the boy. He lifted him. Timothy weighed almost nothing. He carried him toward the entrance, and when they emerged into the daylight, 20 men stood in silence and watched a state investigator carry a ghost out of the mountain. George Holt fell to his knees and began to pray. Cutshaw turned away and wept. Sheriff Shelton removed his hat and held it against his chest, and for the first time in 20 years of law enforcement, his hands shook. Webb set Timothy down gently. He looked into the boy's eyes and asked the question that would haunt Madison County for the next 100 years. "Timothy, what did he do to you in there?" Timothy looked up at the mountains, then back at Webb. His voice was hollow, empty, the voice of a child who had lived inside a nightmare and come out the other side as something else entirely. "He fed the mountain," Timothy said, "and the mountain was always hungry." Webb carried Timothy down the ridge on his back. The boy clung to him like a drowning child gripping driftwood, his fingers digging into Webb's shoulders, his face buried against Webb's neck. He didn't cry. He was past crying. Whatever tears Timothy Baker had owned, Silas Ward had taken them a long time ago. The search party moved in a tight column. Silas walked in the center, his wrists bound with rope, flanked by Cutshaw and Bill Ramsey. He moved easily, almost peacefully, as if he were taking a Sunday stroll. That calm disturbed the men more than anything they'd found in the cave. A man surrounded by evidence of murder, bones and blood and a starving child pulled from darkness, and he walked like a man without a single regret in his body. Halfway down the trail, George Holt broke formation. He shoved past two men, grabbed Silas by the collar, and slammed him against a tree. "Where is my daughter's body? You tell me right now. You tell me where you put her." Silas looked at George with those flat gray eyes. "I didn't put her anywhere. The mountain received her. There's a difference." Cutshaw pulled George off before he could swing. George was shaking, his whole body vibrating with a fury that had no release. Thomas steadied his brother and whispered, "Not here, George. Not like this. Let the law handle him." George spat on the ground at Silas's feet. "The law didn't save my Sarah. The law sat in an office while this animal fed my girl to the dirt." Nobody argued with him. Nobody could. They reached Marshall by late afternoon, February 1916. Sheriff Shelton locked Silas in the single jail cell behind his office. The cell had held moonshiners and horse thieves, men who cursed and kicked the bars and demanded lawyers. Silas sat on the cot, folded his hands and closed his eyes. He looked like a man at prayer, except there was nothing holy in that room. Webb brought Timothy to Dr. Emmett Greer, the only physician in Marshall. Greer examined the boy behind a closed door for over an hour. When he came out, his face was ashen. He pulled Webb aside and spoke in a voice so low it was barely audible. "That boy has been starved systematically. His bones are visible through his skin. His wrists show scarring consistent with being bound repeatedly over months. He has burns on his arms and back that were inflicted deliberately. And Mr. Webb, there are marks on him that I cannot explain medically. Symbols, carved into his skin, healed over, which means they were done months ago." Webb closed his eyes. "What kind of symbols?" "Circles, lines, the same patterns your men described finding on the trees." Webb sat down. In 17 years of investigative work, he had seen cruelty in every form the human mind could produce. He had seen men kill for money, for land, for jealousy, for whiskey. But he had never encountered a man who carved his madness into a child's flesh, like scripture into stone. He went back to the jail. He sat across from Silas with a notebook and a lantern between them. It was 8 o'clock at night. Outside, a crowd had gathered. Word travels fast in mountain communities, and by sundown, every family in Madison County knew what had been found on that ridge. Men stood in the street with rifles. Women held their children close. The mood was not grief. It was something older and more dangerous. It was the mood of people deciding whether to let justice work or take it into their own hands. Webb spoke first. "3 people are missing, Mr. Ward. Sarah Holt, Daniel Pierce, Emma Caldwell. A boy was found chained in your cave. Human remains were found on your land. I'm going to ask you questions, and I suggest you answer them." Silas opened his eyes. "Ask. Did you kill Sarah Holt? The mountain took her. Did you kill Daniel Pierce? The mountain took him. Did you kill Emma Caldwell? The mountain took her too." Webb leaned forward. "The mountain didn't take anyone, Mr. Ward. You did. The mountain is rock and dirt and trees. It doesn't take people. Men take people." Silas smiled that terrible smile. "You think you understand this place because you drew lines on a map. You don't understand anything. This land was hungry before the white man came, before the slaves were brought here in chains, before the Cherokee walked these ridges. Something older lives in this soil, Mr. Webb, something that requires payment." Webb didn't flinch. "Where are the bodies?" "There are no bodies. What the mountain takes, the mountain keeps." Webb tried a different approach. He opened his satchel and placed the glass jar on the table between them. The one from the cabin shelf, the one with the small, pale object floating inside. "Tell me what this is." Silas looked at the jar with something that almost resembled tenderness. A finger, a child's finger. Timothy's, to be precise. I took it the first week. He screamed for a long time, but the mountain needed to taste him before it would accept the others. Webb's hand went to his revolver, not to draw it, to steady himself, to feel something solid and real against his palm, while he sat across from a man who spoke of cutting a child's finger with the same tone another man might use to describe planting corn. Why Timothy? Why did you keep him alive? Silas leaned back against the wall. Every altar needs a witness. What's the point of a sacrifice if nobody remembers it? Timothy was my memory, my proof. The mountain spoke to me through him. Webb stood up. He couldn't sit in that room any longer. He walked outside and found Shelton waiting by the door. Did he confess? Shelton asked. He confessed to everything and nothing at the same time. He admits they're dead. He won't say where the remains are. He believes the mountain is alive and he was feeding it. He cut that boy's finger off as an offering. Shelton's face twisted. That's enough for a hanging. It's enough for a trial, and it's going to be the ugliest trial this county has ever seen. But the trial never came. Around midnight, Webb was writing his preliminary report at Shelton's desk when the door burst open. Thomas Holt stood there, out of breath, his rifle in his hand. You need to come to the jail, right now. Webb and Shelton ran to the cell. The door was still locked. The key was still on Shelton's belt, but the cell was empty. Shelton stared at the cot. The blanket was folded neatly. The cot was pushed against the wall, and on the floor, scratched into the wood with a fingernail, was that symbol again. The circle. The 3 lines, the drops at the base. How? Shelton whispered. How did he get out? The door is locked. The window has bars. Webb examined the bars. Solid iron, unmoved. He checked the door. The lock was intact. He checked the walls, the floor, every inch of that cell. There was no way out, no loose stones, no tunnel, no gap. But Silas Ward was gone. The crowd outside erupted. Men shouted. Women screamed. Within an hour, every road out of Marshall was blocked. Every bridge watched. Every trail guarded. Lanterns moved across the ridges like fireflies as search parties fanned out in every direction. Webb stood in the empty cell and felt something he hadn't felt in 17 years of work. Fear. Not the fear of a man facing danger, the fear of a man confronting something that didn't follow the rules he'd built his life around. Locked doors, iron bars, these were certainties, and they had failed. He pushed the fear down. He was an investigator. He dealt in facts. And the fact was that Silas Ward was a man, not a spirit. Men don't walk through walls, which meant there was an explanation. He just couldn't see it yet. For 3 days, Madison County held its breath. February 1916 became the longest week anyone could remember. Families barricaded their homes. Children didn't go to school. Church services were canceled because people were too afraid to gather in one place after dark. The Reverend at Beach Glen Baptist sent word that he would pray for the community from his own home, because even a man of God wouldn't walk those roads at night. On the morning of the 3rd day, a hunter named Clayton Sisk found Silas Ward's body at the bottom of a ravine 2 miles east of Marshall. Clayton nearly stepped on him before he saw him. Silas was lying on his back, arms at his sides, eyes open staring at the sky. No wounds, no blood, no bruises, no sign that he had fallen or been pushed or struggled against anything or anyone. Beside his right hand, an empty glass vial, small, clear, smelling faintly of bitter almonds. Clayton ran to town. Webb and Shelton rode out within the hour. Webb knelt beside the body and examined it with the methodical precision that had defined his career. He checked the hands, clean, no dirt under the fingernails, no scratches. He checked the boots. The soles were barely worn, as if Silas had walked very little to reach this place. He checked the vial. Residue at the bottom. The smell confirmed what Webb already suspected. Poison. Self-administered. Silas Ward had killed himself rather than face a trial. Shelton removed his hat. "It's over." Webb shook his head. "No, it's not. We still don't know where the bodies are. We still don't know how he got out of that cell. And we still don't know who this man was before he came to Madison County." He searched Silas's pockets. Nothing. No identification. No money. No letters. But in the inside pocket of his coat, folded into a tight square, Webb found a single piece of paper. He opened it carefully. It was a page torn from a journal, and the handwriting was small, cramped, and disturbingly neat. It read, "The boy heard them too. He denied it at first, but I saw his eyes when the voices came at night. He heard them. The mountain chose him the way it chose me. I was not the first. I will not be the last. The soil remembers. The stones remember. And when the next one comes, they will find what I have left for them, and they will understand." Webb read it twice. Then he folded it and placed it in his satchel. He looked at the mountains surrounding them, ancient and silent and indifferent. And for the first time in his career, Marcus Webb did not know what to write in his report. They carried Silas Ward's body back to Marshall on a wooden stretcher. Nobody volunteered to touch him. 4 men drew lots, and the losers carried the corpse. When they passed through town, people came out to watch. Nobody spoke. Nobody cheered. A woman in the crowd, old enough to remember the Civil War, crossed herself and said something in a voice too quiet for anyone to catch. Sheriff Shelton asked Webb where they should bury him. Webb looked at the body, then at the mountains. "Somewhere without a marker, somewhere nobody will visit, and burn that cabin to the ground." They buried Silas Ward the next morning in a plot behind the county poor farm, where vagrants and unnamed drifters were laid to rest in shallow graves without ceremony. No preacher spoke over him. No prayer was offered. 2 men dug the hole, dropped the pine box in, and covered it with dirt in under 20 minutes. Shelton drove a wooden stake into the ground to mark the spot, but he didn't write a name on it. He told Webb, "If I had my way, I'd dig a hole so deep even the devil couldn't find him." Webb didn't attend the burial. He was already back on the ridge. He had returned at first light with Cutshaw and 3 other men to do what he hadn't finished the day before. The cabin still stood, cold and silent, and Webb went through it one more time. He pulled up floorboards. He tapped the walls for hollow spaces. He dug beneath the iron stove until his shovel hit rock. Nothing. Whatever secrets Silas Ward had kept inside those walls, he had kept them in his mind, and his mind was now rotting in a pine farm. But the cave was different. Webb spent 6 hours inside that cave in late February of 1916. He cataloged everything. 47 bone fragments, most of them too small and too damaged to identify by sight alone. 3 sets of clothing. A woman's boot, size 6, with the initials EC scratched into the sole. Emma Caldwell. A man's belt buckle, hand-forged, with a deer engraved on the face. Daniel Pierce's father, Ezekiel, identified it that evening without hesitation. He held the buckle in his palm, closed his fist around it, and walked out of Shelton's office without saying a word. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. The clothing fragments told the rest of the story. Sarah Holt's dress, torn into strips, was found pressed between 2 flat stones near the back of the cave. Her hair ribbon had already been recovered from the forest altar. Martha Holt asked to see the dress. Webb advised against it. Martha insisted. When he placed the torn fabric in her hands, she pressed it to her face and inhaled, searching for some trace of her daughter's scent, some proof that Sarah had existed beyond a pile of rags and bone dust. She found nothing. She folded the fabric carefully, placed it in her apron pocket, and walked home alone. Webb wrote in his report that Martha Holt did not cry. He noted this not as a sign of strength, but as a sign of something broken so completely that the mechanism of grief no longer functioned. Timothy Baker was moved to Dr. Greer's home, where Greer's wife, Helen, took over his care. The boy ate when food was placed before him, but never asked for it. He slept only during daylight. At night, he sat upright in bed with his eyes open, watching the door. Helen told her husband after the first week, "That child doesn't sleep in the dark. He waits in it." Webb interviewed Timothy 3 times over the following days. Each interview lasted no more than 30 minutes because the boy would begin trembling after that and his words would dissolve into silence. But in those fragmented sessions, Timothy Baker described what had happened on that ridge with a precision that chilled Webb to his core. Timothy had been walking home from a neighbor's farm in December of 1914 when Silas appeared on the trail. He didn't grab the boy, didn't threaten him. He simply said, "Come with me. I'll show you something no one else has seen." Timothy said no. Silas nodded, turned away, and walked into the woods. Timothy should have run. He knew that. But something in Silas's voice, something calm and certain and almost kind, made him follow. He couldn't explain why. He told Webb, "It was like my feet decided before my head did." Silas brought him to the cave. He showed him the carvings on the walls. He told Timothy that the mountains were alive, that they had been alive since before people existed, and that they spoke to him at night in a language older than any human tongue. Timothy thought the man was crazy. He tried to leave. That's when Silas locked the rope around his wrists. "He said I was chosen," Timothy told Webb. "He said the mountain had picked me to be its memory. He said the others were food, but I was something different. I was the one who would remember." Webb asked Timothy about the victims. The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. "He brought them one at a time. Always at night. They were already hurt when he brought them in, already bleeding. He'd lay them on the stones and talk to the walls. Not to me, not to them, to the walls. He'd say things I couldn't understand, words that didn't sound like words. And then he'd use the knife." Webb stopped writing. "Did he make you watch?" Timothy nodded. "Every time. He held my head so I couldn't look away. He said if I closed my eyes, I'd be next." Webb set down his pen. He looked at this boy, 13 years old, 9 fingers, hollow eyes, a body that weighed less than 80 pounds, and he understood something that would shape the rest of his career. Evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it says, "Come with me," in a voice so gentle you follow it into the dark before you realize the dark has teeth. March 1916. Webb sealed the cave with dynamite. Cutshaw and 4 men hauled stones to cover the entrance. And then Webb detonated a charge that collapsed the passage permanently. George Holt watched from the ridge. When the dust settled, he said, "That's my daughter's grave now. That's all she gets. A hole in a mountain." Webb put his hand on George's shoulder. "I'm sorry, George. I wish I could give you more." George shook his head. "You gave me the truth. That's more than I had yesterday." That same week, Webb ordered the cabin burned. Cutshaw doused it with kerosene and struck the match himself. The men stood in a circle and watched it burn, and not one of them turned away until the last beam collapsed into ash. Cutshaw said afterward, "I've built barns and houses my whole life. That's the first thing I ever enjoyed watching fall." Webb returned to Raleigh and spent the next 4 months writing his report, 230 pages. He documented every piece of evidence, every interview, every symbol carved into every tree. He included sketches of the altars, diagrams of the cave, and transcripts of Timothy's testimony. He also included his conclusions, and this is where Marcus Webb, the man of facts, the man who didn't believe in ghosts, struggled with something he couldn't resolve. He wrote, "Silas Ward was, in my professional assessment, a man suffering from severe and prolonged mental illness, exacerbated by extreme isolation and the absence of any community oversight or psychiatric intervention. His delusions were elaborate and internally consistent, which made them more dangerous, not less. He believed what he was doing was necessary. He believed the mountains required human sacrifice. He was wrong. But his wrongness does not explain everything." Webb continued, "It does not explain how he left a locked cell with iron bars and no visible exit. It does not explain why no one in this region, or any neighboring county, has any record of a man named Silas Ward before 1908. It does not explain the symbols, which I have shown to 3 university professors, none of whom can identify their origin or language. And it does not explain the note found in his pocket, which suggests he believed others would come after him, called by the same force he claimed to serve. Webb submitted his report in July of 1916. It was filed, archived, and forgotten. The war in Europe consumed the nation's attention. Madison County buried its dead and tried to heal. But healing didn't come easy. Timothy Baker never fully recovered. He was taken in by an aunt in Asheville, and by all accounts he lived quietly. He worked in a furniture factory. He never married. He never spoke about what happened on the ridge. But neighbors said he kept every lamp in his house burning through the night, every night, until the day he died in 1961 at the age of 59. His aunt once asked him why he wasted so much kerosene. He said, because the dark still has his voice in it. George and Martha Holt stayed on their farm. George never went above the tree line again. He sold his upper pastures and kept his family close. Martha carried the torn strip of Sarah's dress in her apron pocket every day for the rest of her life. When she died in 1934, the fabric was found folded beneath her pillow, pressed flat, still carrying the faintest trace of blood that time had turned to rust. In 1925, a journalist named Robert Freeman traveled to Madison County to revisit the case. He interviewed surviving witnesses, read Webb's report, and asked the question that Webb himself had circled around but never answered directly. What created Silas Ward? Freeman wrote that the Appalachian South in the early 20th century was a region abandoned by the country it belonged to, a land still poisoned by the legacy of slavery, still divided along racial lines that no law had truly erased, still trapped in poverty so deep that entire generations lived and died without seeing a doctor, a dentist, or a teacher who stayed longer than a year. Emma Caldwell had been fighting illiteracy on that mountain. She was one of the few people who came to help, and she was among the first to die. Freeman argued that Silas Ward was not born a monster. He was made by a nation that turned its back on its most vulnerable places. No psychiatric care, no social infrastructure, no safety net for a mind coming apart at the seams. The mountains didn't create Silas. Neglect did. Poverty did. Isolation did. A country too busy building cities and fighting wars to notice that in its own backyard, people were disappearing and nobody was asking why. But Freeman's article ended with something he couldn't explain. And this is the detail that has kept this story alive for over 100 years. In the spring of 1925, nearly a decade after Silas Ward's death, Freeman visited the site where the forest altars had been found. Shelton had ordered them destroyed in 1916. The stones had been scattered. The clearings had been left to grow over. But when Freeman arrived, the stones in one of the clearings had been rearranged, stacked precisely, deliberately, in the exact same pattern that Webb had documented 9 years earlier. Sheriff Clay, who had replaced Shelton by then, rode out to inspect the site. He confirmed it. The altar had been rebuilt. There were no footprints around it, no tool marks, no sign that any human being had been there. Clay scattered the stones himself. He kicked them down the hillside and told Freeman, "Wind did it. Animals did it. I don't care what did it. It's done." But 6 months later, a hunter reported that the stones were back. Stacked again, same pattern, same position, no footprints, no explanation. Nobody restacked them after that. Nobody went near that clearing again. The forest took it back, as forests always do, and the ridge where Silas Ward built his altars became a place that people in Madison County simply stopped walking through. Not because they were told to, because something in them, something deeper than logic, something older than reason, told them to stay away. Marcus Webb died in 1943. In his personal papers found after his death, There was a single entry written in the margin of his copy of the Silas Ward report. It read, "I have spent my life believing that every mystery has a rational answer. I still believe that. But I also know that some answers are simply beyond the reach of the men asking the questions. Madison County taught me that. Silas Ward taught me that. And whatever lives in that soil, whether it is memory or madness or something I have no name for, it taught me that the mountains do not forget." Timothy Baker's last words, spoken to a nurse in an Asheville hospital on the night he died, were recorded in his medical file. The nurse asked if he was comfortable. Timothy looked past her, toward the window, toward the dark ridgeline barely visible against the sky, and said, "He's still up there. He never really left." The nurse noted it as delirium. But she also noted that when Timothy died 3 hours later, every light in his room flickered once, then went dark. The mountains of Madison County stand today as they have stood for millions of years, silent, patient, keeping whatever they keep in the deep places where no one digs. The cabin is ash. The cave is sealed. The altars are buried under decades of fallen leaves and creeping vine. And Silas Ward's unmarked grave behind the old poor farm has long since been swallowed by grass in time. But the question Silas asked, the one he carved into the floor of a jail cell before vanishing through a locked door, the one he wrote in his journal before drinking poison in a ravine, the one that Marcus Webb circled for 27 years without ever answering, that question is still there, waiting in the silence between the trees, written in a language nobody can read. Was Silas Ward the beginning, or just one chapter in a story the mountains have been telling since before anyone was alive to listen? Nobody knows. And maybe that's the answer.